Welcome back to This Week in Creationism, episode number 45. I'm your host, Joel Duff, and here we take a look at the recent headlines in the world of young Earth creationism. Today, just two items. Ken Ham suggests bats are not mammals. Well, not really, but he should, based on other things that he's just recently published. Now, we're actually going to talk about Ken Ham's continuing campaign against what he calls young Earth evolution, a dangerous movement within young Earth creationism. And his article this week, or Answers in Genesis article this week, is titled, Birds Are Not Dinosaurs. And we're going to look at the hypocrisy of that particular statement and how, and provide an example of how Ken Ham is influenced by the same evolutionary assumptions that he's claiming that these wolves in sheep clothing within the midst of young Earth creationism are. And then second item for today is Institute for Creation Research had a seminar last Saturday, live streamed, called Dethroning Darwin, or Darwin Dethroned, actually was the name. And I just want to briefly talk about some things that happened there. All right, so bats are not mammals, or whales are not mammals, or dinosaurs aren't birds. What's up with all of that? And Dethroning Darwin, we got that coming up. So let's get right to why birds are not dinosaurs and why it matters, according to Answers in Genesis. This is their headlining cover story from Friday all the way up through late on Monday. That's an exceedingly long time for them to leave the same headline article on the very top of their front page on the Answers in Genesis website. Typically, they rotate a new story in every single day, but they kept this one on the top even as they added new articles. Right, so that suggests that this is a real message that they want to get through to their audience, that birds are not dinosaurs. This very dangerous idea in their mind that that some young Earth creationists are claiming that birds, in fact, could be considered to be a type of dinosaur. And this is anathema to Ken Ham and Answers in Genesis. So they're continuing this series on what they consider the dangers of young Earth evolution. So let's look through a few pieces of this particular article. I have a number of things to say about them. And also I will note that I will include a link to my blog post on this, which has more details about one specific portion of this particular article. All right, first thing to notice is there's no authorship ascribed to this particular article. This is consistent with their last three articles in this particular series of reactions to what they call young Earth evolution. And the fact that there's no authorship, they left a note on the bottom of one to say that these articles represent essentially positions of Answers in Genesis. So collectively, we've agreed that this is something that we feel strongly about and is a position statement. So presumably it's been looked at by a number of people, vetted, and this then represents the viewpoint of Answers in Genesis. Now, how much this actually represents just a few individuals that are imposing this idea upon everyone else, or whether collectively everybody at Answers in Genesis really wholeheartedly is behind this, I'll call it attack on other young Earth creationists, a calling out of other young Earth creationists, I can't be sure. But let's look at this. Let's start reading through a little bit of this. One of the primary points of contention, notice that's a very important word right in here in the verse sentence, a primary point of contention between us, right? Now I think us here means Answers in Genesis. They're not representing Creation Ministries International, Institutes for Creation Research, saying us, Answers in Genesis, and young Earth evolution. So here they are. They're presenting a distinction. They're creating a divide. This is a wedge, right? Ken Ham effectively does this. It's us and them about everything. Everything is dualistic. It's you have two choices: be with us, be with them. So what is the primary point, or a primary point of contention? And I'm emphasizing because I just find this amazing that they're going to say this is a primary point of contention, because this is a ridiculous point of contention between us and young Earth evolution, YEE, as they're calling it, is the question of whether birds are dinosaurs. Many within what we call the YEE subcommunity of young Earth creationist camp have made a claim that dinosaurs had feathers and or that modern birds are dinosaurs in some sense. Right? But is this claim valid? We submit, Answers in Genesis. We submit that no feathered dinosaurs have been found. So they're making a claim that nothing that has a feather on it can be called a dinosaur, because they're obviously defining a dinosaur as lacking feathers. And so they're making a claim that no dinosaur has ever been found to have feathers, and that dinosaurs and birds represent distinct groups that do not and cannot overlap. Right? These are completely different, distinct groups that cannot be associated with one another. Now, right off the bat, let's just remind you that Answers in Genesis and young Earth creationists in general, including young Earth evolutionists, have a view of the origin of life on Earth and the diversification of life on Earth. It's called the creation orchard, which means that God created multiple distinct groups which had the capacity to maybe evolve into some variety within those particular groups. So, for example, even among the dinosaurs, God didn't just create one type of dinosaur. God created many different groups that you could use the same sentence they're using here. We could say, we submit that dinosaurs, and let's change that from that theropod Tyrannosaurus type dinosaurs are distinct from hadrosaurs, right? Two completely different kinds of created kinds that don't overlap, and they're completely distinct from one another. Right, so right away we see that even amongst dinosaurs, there's different groups, that each of which are completely and uniquely made within the young Earth creationist model. So this is not any kind of surprise that we would consider birds and other types of dinosaurs to be distinct and cannot overlap, because no creationist thinks they do overlap, and even the young Earth evolutionists don't think that birds and dinosaurs overlap in the sense that Ken Ham is suggesting here. All right, among those prominently saying that in some sense birds are dinosaurs is Dr. Matt LeClain, a professor at Masters University, and then the mention here of Dr. Gabriella Haynes, which is in Answers in Genesis, one of their new hires that has a PhD in paleontology. She wrote an excellent response to some of Dr. McLean's arguments last year. Okay, yeah, I read that response. It's all about Archaeopteryx and other things and how birds aren't dinosaurs. And I am not a paleontological expert on the dinosaur-bird connection or dinosaur-bird fossils. Although, now that I'm saying that, I guess, I'm more of an expert than Gabrielle Haynes is. She has a PhD in paleontology, but she's never actually worked on any of those particular fossils at all. And it is very evident reading her article that she's not aware of all the literature and doesn't understand a lot of those characteristics. And I can say that even not being an expert. But I will say this, I'm not an expert, but I've had a PhD student who has worked on feathered dinosaurs, right? On a couple different species of, now I gave away I'm calling them feathered dinosaurs. Answers in Genesis that disagree. They would call them birds, since they had feathers, but they had many, many other characteristics of dinosaurs. And I've sat on that. My student who worked on these feathered dinosaurs, in fact, worked on the coloration patterns of those things, and actually did a bunch of spectrophotometry and a whole bunch of different analyses of the remains of the feathers. Had on her committee, all right, one of the foremost experts on these bird-like dinosaur fossils. All right, and I got to interact with them, talk to them, see these fossils. I think the most interesting thing about being part of that is to recognize that the number of actual published descriptions of these fossils is limited compared to the actual number of fossils that are in collections that have yet to be described. The way it's been described to me is that there are more bird-like dinosaur fossils in drawers waiting to be described, tenfold more than actually have been described, and that there could be, all collecting could stop today, and there would still be publications coming out describing fossils, brand new species, with brand new different types of characteristics that we've never seen before, that have been described before, for the next 50 years, without even collecting a new fossil. That's how many fossils are already collected and just sort of in line to be described by what is really a fairly select small group of people that are expert enough or have the resources to be able to study these. It takes a lot of special connections as well, because a lot of these fossils are from China. That's where some of the main fossil beds are, where these fossils are found. And so that limits the amount of contact and how the publishing process and all that. It's all very difficult. Anyway, sidelight. I'm saying I'm still not going to claim I've not been brought up as a paleontologist. I'm not an expert in this area. There's a long story as to how that particular student became my PhD student. I basically inherited her from a paleontological expert who was at my institution and left, and still was basically overseeing her process, but I was officially her PhD advisor. I'll say that I vicariously lived through this student and the rest of the committee with respect to being able to just really enjoy learning a bunch of stuff about these types of fossils. So that gave me enough knowledge that when I read through Gabriella Haynes's paper, it's just like mind-numbingly bad in terms of the descriptions. And what she forgets to mention or purposely doesn't mention, I don't know. That article is not an excellent response. And if you don't want to believe me and you think I'm biased, I am going to put a link to Paleologos, the Paleologos channel. Paleologos is a young Earth creationist who really knows a lot about fossils. And he and a couple of his friends, other young Earth creationists, spent some time actually examining that particular paper and discussing it. And they found a whole litany of different issues with it. And they discussed this whole bird dino thing from a young Earth creationist perspective. Now, Answers in Genesis is going to call those individuals young Earth evolutionists and say they're under the influence of evolutionary theory. But nothing could be farther from the truth, knowing them and knowing their biases and knowing their approach to things. But they recognize that Gabriella Haynes's article is really not worth the paper that it's printed on. Unlike many of his colleagues in the Young Earth Evolution Committee, Dr. McLean has gone so far as to say that birds can be considered dinosaurs. Oh, now that sounds completely heretical, right? The way this is written and described in this Answers in Genesis position paper. But what if I change that to say that, what if I just swap out some words? Many of his colleagues in the Young Earth Evolution Committee, Dr. McLean has gone so far as to say that bats can be considered mammals, right? Does that sound as heretical? Probably not. Like, okay, everyone knows that bats are mammals, but why can't birds be considered dinosaurs if bats can be considered mammals? Aren't bats a completely separate created kind, right? They don't have any actual evolutionary relationship to mammals at all within the young Earth creationist perspective, right? They are not related by common ancestry. They're a completely distinct, separate creation. And as we're going to see in this article, one of the arguments for why birds can't be considered to be a type of dinosaur is that they were created on a different day, because they're flying things and dinosaurs are land-living things. And therefore, they're created on completely separate days, and that's like mixing basic types, basic biblical types, flying things versus land animals, right? Beasts of the ground. And so how dare you consider one to be potentially a member of the other, or like, right? What's the wording here? That could be considered, they could actually be considered the same type of thing. But bats are flying things. They're created on a different day, day 5 of creation versus day 6 of creation for other mammals. So how could bats be considered to be mammals? Answers in Genesis list them as a type of mammal. So why can't they list a bird as a type of dinosaur? If birds share a whole bunch of features with dinosaurs, and specifically one variety of dinosaur, one particular strain, one particular type of dinosaurs is very similar to a lot of birds, fossil birds, but even to modern birds, then why can't you consider birds as just a variety of dinosaur, just like a bat is a variety of a mammal? All right, that's what my blog post is about. All right, so I'll link to that in my blog post. What it does is it does just what Paleologos has done. He beat me to it. He had the same idea at the same time I did. He wrote a blog post, "Whales are not mammals." And what he did was he went through this particular article you're looking at, and he simply swapped out he swapped out dinosaur and put in mammal. And he took out birds and put in whales. Right? How could whales be considered mammals when they're not related to them, when they're a different kind of thing? They're a sea creature, not a land-living organism. And that's the same thing I've done and was doing at the same time I saw his particular post. Is I was swapping out the word bat, all right, and bat and bird, and dinosaur and mammal. And when you do that and you simply replace those words through this whole article, Answers in Genesis makes a very compelling case. If their logic in this particular article is good, and if you think this is a compelling case why birds shouldn't be considered a type of dinosaur, should be just classified within the dinosaurs, then they also have made an extremely compelling case that whales as well shouldn't be considered mammals, and bats shouldn't be considered mammals if birds can't be considered to be dinosaurs. I'm getting ahead of myself here. We're ahead of where we are in the article. We are just saying that birds are more similar to dinosaurs than they are to other creatures. Right? That's what Matt McLean said. Birds are more similar to dinosaurs than they are to any other group, just like bats are far more similar to mammals than they are to any other living thing. In fact, bats are more similar to a particular group of mammals within mammals than they are to any other thing, including other mammals. Just like whales are very similar in many different aspects to ungulates, then they're more similar to ungulates than they are to other mammals. And they're certainly more similar to all those mammals than they are to any other type of organism on the face of the earth. And so it seems natural to classify them within the mammals. So birds share a bunch of characteristics with reptiles, and specifically a type of reptile, which are dinosaurs. And in fact, specifically a type of dinosaur, all right, which is a specific type of theropod dinosaur, right? So if that's the case and they're very similar to those, why can't you consider birds simply a variety of a dinosaur? Now, for Answers in Genesis, again, they feel like birds were created on a different day, and so they are a distinct type. But that gets us back to the brats, all right? That gets us back to pterodactyls, or pterosaurs. Dr. McLean and his colleagues have also considered questioning the meaning of the terms dinosaur and bird. Okay, what is the meaning of the, if they're questioning the meaning of the terms dinosaur and bird, don't you think maybe we need to know what the definition that you think a dinosaur is and a bird is? Like, what do you think dinosaurs and birds are? I've read Gabrielle Haynes' article in which she spends many, many, many pages just trying to tell us that birds are not dinosaurs. And yet she never has a definition for what a dinosaur is. She never explains what a dinosaur is. So how do you know if something is different or is similar to something if you don't even define it and you don't give a description? And guess what? This article doesn't define what a dinosaur is either. There's some little hints to vaguely what you might be thinking a dinosaur is, but it doesn't define the specific characteristics that make a dinosaur, and therefore unique and separate from a bird. And now what's implied, of course, is in the statement that there are no dinosaurs that have feathers, is that if you find anything that has maybe lots of anatomy that is very similar to other dinosaurs, but it has a feather, then you simply define it as not a dinosaur. You define it as a bird. But that's a very specific definition of bird and dinosaur that is based on one character alone. All right, so we must ask what the terms dinosaur and bird actually mean, rather than reflexively say that birds are or are not dinosaurs. Yeah, all right, so that's a quote from McLean. He's bringing up a really good point, which is never really addressed here. That approach of questioning those terms, we claim, relies on evolutionary ideas and not the careful analysis of the evidence of Scripture. So here's the suggestion that, well, okay, you're using evolution, or you're looking at characteristics of organisms and trying to figure out relationships of them, I guess. What about just grouping of many characters that are similar? So a similarity matrix. It's not necessarily an evolutionary assumption. You just take a lot of similar characters. There are a lot of similar characteristics between birds and dinosaurs. More similar characteristics than maybe they have different characteristics, depending on the groups, the list that you come up with. But here, the author is suggesting that we need to use the Bible to determine the differences between these groups. That hasn't been terribly successful for baraminology. It's using the Bible to determine these different types. And as we're going to see, it's going to lead down to a bunch of problems. Okay, and not only have young Earth evolutionists assertions borrowed the definitions of dinosaur and bird from an evolutionary perspective, but also that of the word feather. All right, they've even changed the word feather. Somehow, this author thinks he knows exactly what a feather is, and somehow other things that look a lot like feathers aren't feathers, but it's just this is semantics in the sense that he's just deciding this is what I'm going to call a feather, this is what somebody else calls a feather, but these are feathers and these aren't feathers. And that's how he gets away with saying that dinosaurs have never been found with feathers, because he's going to look at anything that seems like a feather and he's going to say, well, that's not quite enough of a feather to be called a feather in my world of defining a feather, and therefore I'm going to say that they don't have feathers because they don't meet my definition of a feather. It gets super annoying to just go around this dance of terminology and just using names and terms in order to separate things, when the whole purpose seems to be creating a absolute line between dinosaurs and birds that is completely unnecessary. As I've said at other times, there's nothing that says that God could not have created a kind of dinosaur, just like he created hadrosaurs and created tyrannosaurs and created velociraptors. And, there's all these different lineages, right? Lots and lots and lots of different separately created dinosaurs. And each one of those different dinosaurs has very different traits, right? Distinctive traits that would be obviously different organisms. I don't see any biblical reason why God couldn't create a lineage of dinosaurs, of small theropod-like dinosaurs that have feathers on them. You don't have to call them birds. You call them dinosaurs that have feathers on them. And yet this seems to be just impossible for Answers in Genesis to consider. They just view it as like the influence of evolution. And they are going to separate birds and dinosaurs as if they're actually two completely different taxonomic groups. And how do they do this? What's one of their methods? Dinosaurs are land-dwelling animals. Right? I guess that's a definition of dinosaur. They're land-dwelling animals. So I guess if you define them that way, then they can't fly. That means they were made on the sixth day of creation. Almost all birds are flying creatures, with some degree, to some degree. And they all have wings. Moa don't have wings. There's a lot of species of moa. They do not have wings. And I would not be surprised if there have been other birds that are extinct that did not have wings. And there's a lot of birds that have tiny little wings why are they called wings? Did you think about that? Penguins have what we might call wings. But if wings are for flying, because they're winged creatures and God made things that are flying things, penguins don't fly, all right? They do not fly across the surface of the sky, all right? Which is the description in scriptures. They're not flying creatures. So why call them wings, right? They're arms is what they are. Just like I have arms. Right? If I move them up and down a certain way, can I call them wings, even though I can't fly? Because there's a bunch of birds that have things that they can move up and down, appendages, right? They can move up and down, but they're not flying, and they can't fly. And Answers in Genesis will say that they never did fly. All right, now you'll get disputes among young earth creationists about whether they could have flown in the past. Like maybe God created a bird that used to fly, but then it turned into an ostrich later. But then again, that's kind of like saying God created a land animal, which then went into the water and became whales. And obviously we can't do that because they've already written an article about how that's an evolutionist idea. So Answers in Genesis is more likely to say that you've got your emus, you've got your ostriches, you have your tinamous, you've got your penguins, right? You've got your moa birds, there's a whole bunch more. These are all things that are what we call flightless birds. However, when I say flightless bird, there is a evolutionary assumption there, right? The evolutionary assumption is that all birds are related to one another, and one of the things that they share from a common ancestor is flight. But then some individual birds have lost the ability to fly and developed into these groups that we call the flightless birds. But for Answers in Genesis, they are separately created organisms that never have been able to fly, and therefore they're not flying creatures, and therefore they're not created on the fifth day. They are land-dwelling animals that have feathers. But the Bible doesn't say that having feathers is something that makes something different than everything else. It doesn't say feathers is what makes a flying creature, one of the flying things. After all, bats are flying things, and they say that bats were made on the fifth day. They don't have feathers, right? So they're getting tied down to individual characteristics as if that characteristic is the defining thing that makes it what it is in terms of a category. Some birds didn't even have wings, so this is not even an accurate statement. And almost all birds are flying creatures, but not all of them are, so you do have to account for those. Therefore, they were likely all made on day 5. What? All made on day 5? Why would the non-flying birds be made on day 5 when they don't fit the primary characteristic of what was created on day 5? Right? So they're not even being biblically consistent here, even though they're saying we need to use the Bible to define this difference between dinosaur and bird. And what do they think pterosaurs are? I mean, I know pterosaurs are not grouped within the dinosaurs. They're a separate lineage, but there again, I'm doing an evolutionary thing, right? I'm thinking about the relationships of them as if they have common ancestry. But for young Earth creationists, there's just reptiles, right? Is sort of a group you can kind of identify as having similar characteristics, right? The reptiles are turtles and snakes and lizards and crocodiles and pterosaurs, right? Dinosaurs and birds, right? Those are all have similar characteristics, right? So pterosaurs, are they saying that pterosaurs aren't part of reptiles because reptiles were made on the 6th day, right? But pterosaurs are flying creatures, and so they're made on the 5th day, so they should not be considered a type of reptile. It's the same logic. They should be writing an article, pterosaurs are not reptiles. They should not be included in the group, the larger group, reptiles, because that assumes some kind of common ancestry, and you're therefore biased by evolution to say that. And we need to consider them completely distinct and separate and recognize that. So if you're going to do that, you just need to recognize every group as a different group and not have a hierarchical classification. Why do creationists use hierarchical classifications? Why do they accept any form of hierarchical classification at all? Okay, so what's the problem? By saying or agreeing with this evolutionary claim that birds are dinosaurs or are most similar to dinosaurs, but they are most similar to dinosaurs compared to any other organism. I mean, that's not just saying it. That is just recognizing a characteristic of God's creation. Dr. McLean is mixing groups made on different days of creation. So this seems to be the thing that's really offensive, is like these are categories of things that God made. And because they're in different categories on different days, that clearly shows that they should not be grouped together. All right, whales are sea creatures created on a different day than mammals. Therefore, Answers in Genesis should remove whales from the list of mammals on the Ark Encounter, because they just list them within as if they're just another type of mammal. They should remove bats as being a type of mammal as well. Bats have completely unique characteristics not found in any other mammal, right? And they're created on a different day. They're part of a different basic type or kind of organism from a scriptural point of view. And yet this is not what they do. So Ken Ham, this is completely hypocritical. Or my challenge would be, become consistent. Get a whole new taxonomic classification system, because you are completely inconsistent and unfairly characterizing and separating from other young earth creationists over something that you yourself are guilty of. Okay, remember in Genesis 2 that God brought the animals to Adam to name. This implies that Adam was capable of both naming them and distinguishing them by sight. Okay, so what does that have to do with, okay, dinosaurs can't be a type, birds can't be a type of dinosaur, right? Bats, you think that Adam could have recognized a bat compared to a mouse? I sure do think so. And he would have called them different things. Does that mean it's wrong to call a bat a type of mammal? It sounds like you're saying that, because you're saying you can't call birds a type of dinosaur. Get consistent here, right? There's no reason why dinosaurs or birds should be considered similar unless it's presumed a priori that some dinosaurs had feathers. Not a priori. We look at the fossil record and look, you want to have observations, the facts, right? The observations are that there are fossils of things that if you didn't have the feathers in the fossil and you just looked at them, you'd say, like, absolutely, that has all the characteristics of a generic, that has all the characteristics that unify all the dinosaurs. All right. So it's very easy to put it in that dinosaur group of a broader group. And then you say, well, but it also has feathers. All right, now they're just going to say, well, it has feathers, so therefore it's not a dinosaur. That's just not paying attention to just basic observations. This fits the scriptural implication that Adam could visually distinguish between groups. I'm not saying that certain birds, but the thing is, birds have different groups, right? I mean, could Adam tell the difference between an eagle and a chicken, right? Could he tell the difference between an eagle and an ostrich? Definitely. And so he would have named them separately, right? For young earth creationists, he would have looked at those, given them different names. Another significant problem with arguing that birds are dinosaurs is the cultural context of the claim. While Dr. McLean may think that making the above statement does not imply evolution, the public is inundated daily with evolutionists making the exact same claim. Oh, so because evolutionists are making this claim, therefore we can't accept it. Well, don't evolutionists make the claim that whales evolved from land animals? And isn't the public inundated with that all the time? Right? But you're still willing to call a whale a type of mammal. If not, start writing articles about how whales are not mammals. Start writing articles about how bats are not mammals. Because evolutionary biologists, used inundate students with this idea that bats are a mammal and share common ancestry with other mammals. And that mammals were, if you look at the fossil record, the pattern is that the earliest mammals were ground-dwelling organisms. And if they were ground-dwelling organisms on land, whales live in the water now, and they don't show up in the fossil record till later, so therefore they evolved from a land animal. And then bats are flying things, and they don't show up in the fossil record till after the origin of mammals, and therefore bats evolved from a common ancestor that was a land animal. Right? That's just part and parcel of evolutionary theory's explanation for the origin of different groups of mammals. And so if you object to this whole thing of saying, oh, dinosaurs existed, and then out of the dinosaurs, one group of dinosaurs has accumulated a number of characteristics that are more bird-like, and eventually there's feathers on these things, and then they lose some of the characteristics that shape them as dinosaurs, and now you just have modern birds, right? But from a young Earth creationist perspective, you just say that they're organisms that have characteristics that have bits of both, just like bats have wings, like birds do. But they have lots of other characteristics that make them similar to mammals, and so we say they're a type of mammal because they share a bunch of characteristics with other mammals. But they do have distinctive features that separate them from other kinds of mammals. It's not that hard. It really isn't. This is completely unnecessary. Just because you're upset that this is the story and you feel like if you admit that birds are most similar to dinosaurs and you just decide we can classify them within the dinosaurs as just another type of dinosaur, that somehow you're giving it all away and you're just admitting that evolutionary biology is true, well, then you already have admitted that because you've accepted all kinds of other things that are also based on evolutionary assumptions. I'm not even going to get into the fact that suddenly we have to talk about critical race theory right in the middle of this article about dinosaurs and birds. All right, then there's a bunch of other nonsense here. Let's just get right down to the end. The only reason to do so is the same assumptions that drive the evolutionary model are smuggled into the creation model. Right, we got these creationists out here. They're smuggling their evolutionary learning, and they're trying to make it compatible with young Earth creationists. We got to stop that. We got to stop that mindset. Namely, that some dinosaurs had feathers. How many times do I have to say it? What's wrong with a organism that has dinosaur features also having feathers? You say God couldn't have done that, especially if you're talking about dinosaurs. And there's a bunch of different dinosaurs that had feathers and undisputed feathers. We're not talking about like some proto feather, which you could argue about whether that actually becomes a full-fledged feather. Undisputed feathers on organisms that definitely did not fly, all right? Didn't have wings, right? Use those feathers for completely different purposes than flight. And so to deny the existence of those is just to deny the facts in front of your face, right? And the way they're really denying them is, again, by just changing terms and changing definitions. And for what purpose? What purpose? What purpose? It's just a way of communicating. We name things. What is classification for? To help us be able to identify things that have similarities so that I don't have to memorize every single thing about, if you tell me something's a mammal, I already know a bunch of its characteristics because mammals share a bunch of characteristics. You don't have to tell me, I have a name for this organism, but I'm not going to tell you what thing it's like. And therefore, you're going to have to memorize everything about this organism. Then if you want to learn about it, if you want to know about it, you're going to have to go in and measure every single characteristic of it. How does it, breathe, and how does it, all these different things, right? So that's the beauty of classification, of the classification system, is that it groups things together that are similar to one another. And the more, if you're a species, you're really similar to each other. If you're in a genus, you have a lot of similarities to each other, but you're not as similar as two members of the same species or two species in the same genus. But if you're in different genera, if you're in different families, You share similarities with all the other members of that family, but you could still be quite distinct. And obviously, if you're in orders, you're more distinct. But still, if you're in the same order, you have more similarities than you do with something else. So what about birds? Birds are more similar and have more characteristics that are similar to other dinosaurs and reptiles, and therefore they're in the group of reptiles. They are a type of reptile. Just like bats are very distinctive, and yet if I ask you to tell me stuff about bats and you didn't know anything about bats, but you knew something about general characteristics of mammals, like they make milk, then you're like, oh, a bat's a mammal? Oh, well, it must make milk. But sure enough, it does. Okay, so yes, that is the usefulness of classification. Now, along come young Earth creationists, and they do want to say that all organisms don't share any common ancestry. But they still want to say they share characteristics, right? So they recognize that there is this thing that is mammal-like, and they want to use the classification, because it's useful. That's why Ken Ham wants to call bats mammals, because he recognizes that if you just say they're not mammals, well, then you're going to have to you still have to explain why they have the similar features of mammals. That's where you get common design from. But see, the common design argument is just a way of grouping things in hierarchical classification by common design. God used similar patterns to make things and then use more specific patterns within those groups. Why isn't you could use the common design argument for birds being a type of dinosaur? All right. Dinosaurs, here's the final statement. Now remember, this is a statement that represents the position of Answers in Genesis. And I think this is why Gabrielle Haynes was conscripted to write this big article on birds and bird fossils. And unfortunately, it's so bad that, I think she was given, you're the expert now, right? We've hired you. You're the expert. The rest of us don't have this expertise. She comes in, writes this big article. It looks like it's all detailed, has tables and all kinds of stuff in it. Tons of wrong information on there, wrong assumptions, missing data, all that. In other words, it's garbage in and garbage out. But unfortunately, the powers that be at Answers in Genesis apparently believe what she's written and think she's made a good argument. And so therefore, they're now going to stand on that piece of garbage. And they're going to make this statement now, as if this is the truth. Dinosaurs had no feathers. And claiming they did actually requires a reliance on evolutionary interpretation of fossils and should not be accepted by creationists. All right, creationists out there, you cannot accept that dinosaurs had feathers. Some dinosaurs had feathers. We haven't told you exactly what a dinosaur is, unless all it is just it's not a thing that has feathers. Right? I guess if you can define it away. All right, if that's the case, then what's going to happen is, as you find more and more and more and more organisms that kind of look like dinosaurs that have feathers, you simply are going to keep removing more things as being dinosaurs. We used to think this was a dinosaur, but we found it has feathers. So now we're going to remove it from the dinosaurs and put it into the birds. The thing is, almost all of those are going to be flightless things. And then you're still going to have this whole thing where you created this argument that, well, these birds, because feathers are what makes a bird, but feathers are also flighted things, but these things didn't have flight, so they were created on the sixth. It just gets massively confusing. Okay, first topic done. I just have a few words to say about Darwin dethroned. ICR, Institute for Creation Research, had a seminar series last Saturday. I guess in honor of would be the wrong word. In response to Darwin Day and Darwin's birthday. And so they had their three, I call it the three biggies, or the three that are left at ICR. Dr. Brian Thomas, Dr. Tim Clary, geology. Brian Thomas is the, soft tissue biomolecules person. And Dr. Randy Gugliuzza, who is a anatomist, biologist. Right, so Brian Thomas talked about the origin of life and how Darwin can't explain that. And then Tim Clary talked about the sedimentary evidence and the global flood, and how all the evidence points to the world being young because all these layers were obviously laid down recently. So how does that dethrone Darwin? Darwin needed a lot of time. And since he doesn't have any time, therefore it doesn't matter whether evolutionary theory theoretically might actually be able to develop diversity from common organisms. There wasn't enough time, so it couldn't have happened. It didn't happen that way. And then Guglielmo comes in and does his whole continuous environmental tracking thing. Really found that particular talk was really difficult to listen to because, well, for one thing, Dr. Guglielmo is by far the best speaker. ICR does not have a good stable of dynamic speakers, and that's a big problem for them. But Guglielmo is actually a very engaging speaker, and I think he is really adept at drawing people in and then guiding them through a thought process. And he sounds very logical. But boy, the design stuff and his description of natural selection and Darwinian evolution, even though he's trying to use quotes from evolutionists to explain how evolution works, still get a very strong vibe of cherry picking and not really understanding evolutionary theory. And of course, he's trying to build up this process of the organisms are responding to the environment. It's not natural selection. That natural selection is not, he thinks it's some kind of force that we need to reject. And maybe I'll take a look at some of his stuff from his talk some other time. The Q&A session at the end was really just very disappointing. That I would have hoped that they had some decent questions, but they had terrible answers to them. I don't know if they just weren't prepared, but surely they're questions they get all the time. Like, one of the questions was, where did all the human fossils go? Like, why aren't there human fossils? And that was something that was discussed in the chat quite a bit. And Timothy Clary's response to that was, well, all the people might have gotten washed off the continents. Like late in the flood, they got washed off the continents, and so they were deposited in shallow sediments. And in shallow sediments, you don't really get the really quick preservation, and therefore they didn't get preserved. That was about the weakest response I've ever heard to that, because that was all he came up with. There's many other things, many other bad ideas as well, but they sound more logical than that. That was just a really poor response. I'm showing this picture because they advertised this heavily, and they claimed that it was sold out. Right, the day before it said sold out. You can still watch it online. I was watching online, and at the time, most of the time that I was on, there was about anywhere from 120 to 180. It might have gone over 200 at some point. People who were watching virtually. And as you can see, I took this screenshot because only a couple times did they pan away or pan back from the talk itself and the speaker. And this was, let's see, I can't remember how far into this seminar it was, but it was during the talks. All right. So, and this is the crowd at the ICR Museum Discovery Center. As you can see, that's not exactly my concept of being sold out. So between people online and people here, this isn't a really large group. You compare this to something that, like, say, Answers in Genesis would do. If they had a live seminar, they're going to have several thousand people watching at any one point in time, and they're going to have tens of thousands of views within a few days. And they have in their, and I've been to the Ark Encounter and the Creation Museum, and they have space for, actually, I don't know, what is it, 800 to 1,000 at the Ark Encounter, and 400 or 500 at least at the Creation Museum. So a very large auditorium, and it's often packed. So that's really showing you the difference between the footprint of Institute for Creation Research versus, say, the footprint of Answers in Genesis at this point in time, even though ICR is sort of the grandfather organization of all other young Earth creationist organizations. This was their media specialist who is doing the Q&A session, and I only took this screenshot for one reason. I was fascinated by the background that ICR used. All right, so here you see on either side of the screen there, you can't really see the wall texture very well, but this is what it looks like up close. And these are laminations, like at the bottom of a lake. And the waviness is because, you have, this would be a fairly shallow lake. And the motion of water then disturbs the bottom. And then what you have is layers laid down either from storms or more likely from annual fluctuations of like a bunch of organic material, say in the winter, that is then falling to the bottom and then being preserved in an algal mat. And then you have more sedimentation maybe the next year that brings in sediments on top of that. And so you get these could be annual laminations, or which we call varves, but they might be multiple varves per year as well. But nonetheless, what I liked about it was the image for me was they're showing very fine scaled structure found within the geological column. And it shows that the geological column is a fairly, in many areas, is fairly placid. Right? You can't form what you're looking at right here in a global flood. Right? This is not a chaotic flood laying down these would be very, very thin layers. They're blown way up here. So this is more like millimeters, right, in size between each one of these layers. And they go across long distances. So this would be a lake that is then experiencing, changing climate patterns over a period of months or maybe a year versus a chaotic global flood. So I'm not really sure why they're using that particular image. I think it's a cool looking background and maybe they just liked it for the aesthetic of it. But to me, it doesn't really say global chaotic flood, right? It says, oh, this is an example of the slow accumulation of material over time. And if I count these up, I'm sure that there's several hundred layers here. So this could represent several hundred years of lake deposit sediments that are happening here. Definitely not 1 year. So just a weird observation from this particular seminar. I just found myself constantly looking at that, like, why? Like, why did they pick that? That would be it for this week in creationism. Just 2 items. I've got several other things saved up, but I need to work on them a little bit more. So I'll save those for another day. And I'm sure that come this Friday, there'll be another article out about young Earth evolutionists and the next problem that they present to other creationists or to Answers in Genesis. But honestly, I don't know how they can sit there and say that this is one of our main issues with young Earth evolutionists, is that they want to call dinosaurs, or I'm not even saying, that's a wrong way of saying it. They don't want to call birds dinosaurs. They're just admitting from the evidence in front of them that birds have similarities to dinosaurs, and there's no reason why you can't call birds a type of a dinosaur, just like we could call bats a type of mammal or whales a type of mammal. Hey, thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.